escaping history, except, well, I didn't make it a career. I worked 30 years for the Government of Canada, the Department of Agriculture. I worked at Research Branch, Communications Branch, and in Market and Industry Services Branch. Most of that time being involved in communication of one form or another. I have been a member of the Merrickville and District Historical Society. I was going to say 30 years, but my daughter's birthday is this weekend, so it must be 32 years now that I've been a member, and have recently returned to active duty there. So as you know, I do write the column, History at Large, that appears in the Johnson newspapers. That does give me somewhat of a free hand to comment, so should I choose, because I don't live here and I can avoid repercussions if necessary. I don't have to worry about not being invited to dinner or that sort of thing. Laura had spoken about Remington at our Historical Society in the fall, and I'm glad to be here to talk about the Revolutionary War history of Ogdensburg, which seems to fall between, quite naturally, what's known about the French and Indian War and what's known about the War of 1812. So we've commemorated those battles, and if you could pull up the next slide as well. And we remember this by Davies. This is part one of the Battle of the Thousand Islands in August of 1760. Fort La Présentation there, the Oswegatchie. You can see the scale is quite odd, and it's the British gunboats capturing the last French vessel, the L'Outaouais, out there, and then it went down river, and the fall of Fort Lévis, that's on what's now called Chimney Island. It was called Chimney Islands, and shortly after the American Revolution, the British moved out and knocked everything down. They just left the chimneys standing. And right up and into the late 1880s, the British guns that had been dismounted from the fort were stacked on either side of the river, just sort of piled there. Who knows where they went from there. So the fort becomes British. They restore it. It hadn't been completely dismantled. Thank you, that's better. And they call it Fort Oswegatchie. Oswegatchie was part of the great unknown during the British regime. They had a notion if it was on the river somewhere between Montreal and Fort Frontenac or Fort Cataraqui, which is now Kingston, but weren't quite sure. And Rogers Rangers were going to be sent over the Adirondacks to find it, but Jeffrey Amherst and the Anglo-American Army got there first, and that was it. Montreal fell. Montreal surrendered. Montreal was indefensible. It was indefensible then, and years later when the Americans arrived, and we'll get to that, it was indefensible then too. So it pretty much settled down during the British regime. If you want to toss up the next one, please. So it was, if we can find it here, I'm all the way, does that say? There it is, Swagatsy. Swagatsy. So it's at the top of the rapids, and it's used as a forwarding post to British forts in the interior and to the fur trade that existed there. There wasn't a whole lot of British settlement along here until after the American Revolution. There was Fort Niagara. There was Oswego. Here, where the British also had a fort, Niagara and Detroit and further up. So it's a pretty quiet place, forwarding, coming and going troops, supplies for the fur trade. So next slide. So it was a pretty quiet place. Some trade went on here, but mostly was going to the interior. This is by a Canadian illustrator named Jeffries, many years dead, who illustrated Canadian history in umpteen books. But it tells the story of the fur trade, furs coming in, the musket going out, other packaged goods, and it was coming up through here. And so the British were here until 1796, and they did have a burial ground here, which, from what I've been able to tell, if anybody knows where Rose Street is on the other side of the river, it's between Harrison and I'm drawing a blank. Jefferson and Harrison. Read my notes. There's a sort of an empty space up there between the developed lots, like long backyards. And I'd really like to swing some ground penetrating radar over that just to see what it may show. But we all know things did not go well after the French and Indian War, taxes, and all those nasty evil things that none of us like today, that the colonists took a dim view of. And when the American Revolution did break out, Washington and others thought we should grab Canada. So he sends two armies, one under Richard Montgomery that goes down to Lake Champlain and Richelieu, defeats some small British fortifications there, and occupies the indefensible Montreal. The governor is able to escape downriver with the soldiers to Quebec, and shortly thereafter, Benedict Arnold, if you show the next slide, please. Benedict Arnold arrives after this harrowing trip, where some of his men deserted, many died along the way, and they finally made it to the south shore of the St. Lawrence opposite Quebec. Quebec, for any of you who've been there, it's fortified. The fortifications today are rebuilt, but that's what they were facing. And it came right down to the wire that his men's enlistment were going to run out midnight on New Year's Eve, or midnight that begins New Year's Day. So they attacked Quebec. It was a disaster. Benedict Arnold is wounded and taken off the field. Richard Montgomery is mortally wounded along with a number of his officers. There's a very famous painting, like so many of the era, that looks like he's so gallantly dying, and it wasn't gallant at all. They were badly shot up. And the British were the first to arrive, and the Americans pulled back, and Arnold with General Wooster were there in Montreal. So what goes on, they build a fort here, among other places. Montreal Island was full of forts. But the Americans built a fort at the top of another set of rapids called the Cedars, or they said they called Fort Cedar. And here we had a very, very active garrison. King's 8th, they are, if you show the next slide, please. Oh, sorry about that. I'm looking at my slides out of order. This is the less than romantic death of Montgomery. The British had built a succession of barricades coming into the lower side of the city, and they had guns and men with muskets in the windows. Okay, so we go to the King's 8th. King's 8th was divided up into different companies, so that there's a company here, there was a company at Oswego, a company at Niagara. The best had gone off ultimately, they just sort of never left town. Property changes hands, so to speak, and Brant, who gained quite a bit of fame during the war. You know, the next slide, please. A view of the Mohawk warriors. As a reenactor, I have met these guys in the woods playing at war. I don't ever want to do it in real life, because these guys, when they play, are real serious, and you know they had no love for the Americans. So they get down there to the Cedars. The American colonel, Timothy Bettle, in command, leaves. Instead of sending a junior officer, he goes to Montreal and says, the British and Indians are almost at the gate, and another American major, Henry Sherburne, he takes 140 men to reinforce the place. So Forster learns that Sherburne has come from Montreal, but he went back through sort of a misinformation campaign, and a little battle was fought when the fort didn't surrender. They took the Americans captive, captured two small artillery pieces from them, and then the Iroquois were free to have whatever they wanted from the stores and personal belongings. They weren't allowed to keep their prisoners. Of course, as you know, the rumors spread that the Iroquois had massacred prisoners and all of that. Did not happen. Sherburne eventually comes. Can I get the next slide, please? So we're here where the Cedars is. That's just inside Quebec. And if you take the highway to Montreal, you'll see a sign that says, they said, the Cedars. But there's no historic plaque there, strangely enough. So the British and their native allies proceed to cross the river. But just before they get to cross the river, an American party comes across, and they defeat that, and they have more prisoners to hold. And they cross over, and they get to the island of Montreal. And you can see Montreal is just full of all kinds of little forts. Even then, this is from 1760. The remains of Fort Sainte-Ville are still there. They're on private property, but you can get permission to visit them. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, say what you like about him, and until he became a traitor, he was a great man. And he rallied the troops, and he pushed back against the British and Indians, and they didn't know quite how many they had, but rumors got thousands. So they withdraw across the river, and they're going to cross, the Americans, with the bateau, which any of you have been to Founders Weekend, you'll have seen. Well, remember those two guns that were captured? When you start firing guns at boats coming across the river, they pretty soon change their mind that they're not going to come across. The Americans under Arnold, that Arnold sent, withdrew, and then the rest here traded the prisoners back and forth. The Americans reneged on the deal, so the few British that they had hoped to negotiate for remained in captivity, but the Americans were allowed to go free. It's interesting, there was another set of Iroquois, the Kahnawake Mohawks, who were aligned with the Americans, who brought the message, say, Arnold wants you to surrender, and their Indian brothers or cousins say, well, no, thank you very much, we like it the way it is. And so it didn't happen. So as I said, that's the big action out of Ogdensburg right off near the beginning of the war. And then things sort of settled down for a year or so. Next slide. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne is going to sever the colonies by heading up Lake Champlain and down the Hudson, and he's going to end the war. As you know, it did not turn out well. Coming through Ogdensburg was another force that was to come down and to capture Fort Stanwix. The commander of that has a really interesting name. His name, if people read it, it says St. Ledger. As most of you know, written English is a set of exceptions to which there are no rules. Rough, through, though, O-U-G-H ending. Barry St. Ledger, not in English. His name is Sillinger. How you get from St. Ledger to Sillinger, I don't know, but there's a lot of that in English. So he goes down with his Indian allies, his regulars, the provincials, and they're going to capture Oswego. But if any of you have seen the movie not Last of the Mohicans, Drums Along the Mohawk, Colonel Herkimer is mortally wounded. Well, there's a big fight at Oriskany. Americans claim it as a victory because the British forces moved back to go to Fort Stanwix to finish the siege there, but they don't have guns big enough to do it, and their Indian allies began to dribble away, and they realized it was fruitless, so they come back. And after that, next slide, please. Oswegatchie processes a number of raids. Raids are coming out of Niagara, but just about every place there's a fort, and other places there was an attack or a raid of some description that came down from Lake Ontario up here from the St. Lawrence or across. One raid in 1778, little community of Manheim. Has anyone ever heard of Manheim, New York? It was attacked. It gets one line in a history book if you're lucky. It's more important if you live there as part of your local history. So that happened, and then, as I said, the Americans knew where Oswegatchie was, and they knew that raids had and would come out of there. Let me got the map here. So they send a raid. Find myself in my notes here, because they want to prevent, forestall raids coming in to this area. And a fellow named Captain McLennan, with his Lieutenant Hardenberg, all of the 1st New York, a sergeant, a corporal, and 30 privates and as many an Oneida, they arrive outside Fort Oswegatchie here. They captured 2 Onondaga and a couple of four soldiers, who confirmed that Captain Davis, who commanded here at that time, from another regiment, the 31st Regiment, has 40 men and 4 artillery pieces. The soldiers of the 31st, interestingly, for what it's worth, are from Ireland for the most part. And I want to correct an error that I made. I said the King's 8th were at Saratoga. I lied. It was a company of Grenadiers and Light Infantry from the 31st that were with that fateful trip that ended really poorly for the Brits down at Saratoga. Now, so they know what's there, and they know it has some small guns, but they couldn't have been very big guns because the walls aren't that robust. Next slide. So these are likely the type of guns that were in the fort. This is a wall gun. It's like a huge musket. Get mounted on a wall and carried around the walls and mounted. And this is a swivel gun that was often on ships, but they were also used inland on forts. So when you couldn't put a large gun in a fort, had these things that could be used to fire a large ball or fire like a shotgun. Well, the fort could not be this as they were early in the war. First New York withdrew up the Oswegatchie, onto the Black River, over and down, eventually getting to the upper waters of the Mohawk, and then down to Fort Stanwix. Had they had more men and had come earlier, they really missed a great deal, because General Haldeman, senior commanding officer, his aide-de-camp had just passed through, and he was carrying orders to the western forts. And what a coup that would have been, to be able to capture, British orders and know what they were about. But they were building a fort down on Carleton Island, Fort Haldeman, the ruins of which still stand there. Anyway, he got away free. Terrific. But the Americans say, geez, we'd still like to get rid of that thorn in our side if we can block the St. Lawrence. Geez, that sounds like the War of 1812. If we can block the St. Lawrence here at the narrow point, we're going to choke off a lot of British stuff going into the interior. And at Stanwix, Colonel Gus Van Schaik wanted to do it again, but that never happened. And from the beginning, there were the rumors, loyalists. Loyalists are coming, the Indians are coming, so we'll stay where we are. Didn't quite work. Fort Stanwix didn't really do a good job of protecting the valley, because the Loyalist regiments bypassed the fort and raided into the Mohawk and to Schoharie valleys with ease, and they were taking prisoners. Next, and here's an example. You got taken prisoner by the British. If they just took you to Montreal, Quebec, you got a good deal. But if they put you on a prison ship, these hulks, your chances of survival were bad, and many were taken also to England, to Devon and Dartmoor prison, and very few did well there. We know one party captured by name. There was Lieutenant Scudder. He and his troops were out cutting hay for Fort Stanwix the end of July in 1779. Some of them were killed, and the whole band was captured lock, stock, and barrel and brought back here. And then I haven't got that far into the history to find out what happened to them. We may never know. One of the problems of getting to some of this history is that during the Second World War, a whole lot of British archival records were destroyed. When the time came to save what you need, you prioritize, and there was a whole lot of stuff that just was lost. And there are many books that will make reference to the material, but the material no longer exists. Later in 1779, we get a new commander from the 84th Regiment, Royal Highland immigrants, a fellow named Daniel Robertson. I have a sort of a connection with this guy at a distance, is that he acquired land grant because he had been a veteran of French and Indian War, and being a veteran of the American Revolution, he acquired more land, and from his men who didn't want the land but wanted the money, he bought, and so he amassed quite a large chunk of land up the Ottawa River from Montreal in what's now Argenteuil County. And I just happened to own a small piece of property that was part of his holdings at one time. As he got older, he sold bits of it off for cash. He kind of balanced it out because he went up in ranks in the local militia and took government positions such as judgeships and magistrate and that sort of thing. He just sort of balanced his income by selling land. And at this time, when he arrived here, he was in his late late 40s. He had been captured at Fort St. Jean when, as I mentioned, Montgomery came down the river. He was eventually exchanged and came here. So in 1780, he'd been here through the winter. They sent a party down into the valley and Mohawk Valley in September of 1780, and they burned farms and barns in the area of Fort Dayton. It's important to raid in the fall when people have their hay and oats and wheat and barley in storage, and so what you can't take away, you burn. The following year, there was a raid on Canada Creek, same type of things. They slaughtered horses, they slaughtered cows. A farmer and his son were killed, and also two militia men. Robertson also commanded in June 1782, and there may have been two raids going on at the same time. They just weren't, you just didn't pick up the phone and say, I'm going to raid into the valley this month, what about you? There were two raids, several hundred strong. Next slide. You've all seen this movie, Drums Along the Mohawk. Great piece of fiction. But that covers Robertson's raid. The raid on Ellison's Mill is mentioned. You also, the Battle of Oriskany, where General Herkimer dies in surgery when his legs taken off. So this is covers a lot of the stuff that we just sort of touched on here right now. So there's a following year, there was another raid, and pardon me, this raid, they killed and captured Americans, and it was all in all a nasty business. And then they attacked Fort Herkimer, named after the late general. And this is where it gets really interesting as I wind up here. According to local lore, the siege was abandoned because of the noises of horns and pots beaten from a distant wedding party that was thought to be an advancing American army. Well, I don't know why anybody would celebrate a wedding with all that noise when your enemy is in the valley, unless of course you're loyalists or something, but even that doesn't make sense because you don't want to draw attention to yourself. You want to be out of town months, if not years, before. So Robertson supposedly gives up the raid on Fort Herkimer. Meanwhile, there may be a couple of dozen Indians raiding generally in the valley still, but he returns. And he was ordered to Fort Michilimackinac, not Mackinac as many people say. That's a silent C on the end. He was a stricter for order, and they needed him to straighten out the bookkeeping accounts of the British Indian Department up there. So he left Oswegatchie in August of 1782, and by that time, it's pretty much end of the revolution. Next slide. And so we wind up with the peaceful fort. Here, Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, and it was pretty much game, set, and match as far as the British were concerned. They weren't going to put any more effort into this. They had other issues. So with the Treaty of Paris, American independence is confirmed, but still a number of forts, like this idealistic view of Fort Oswegatchie, are occupied by the British, and they do until 1796. So Oswegatchie, Oswego, Niagara, Detroit, Mackinac, and I might be missing one, which were supposed to be turned to the British, by the British to the Americans in 1783. It was another 13